Welcome to another episode of Tank Talks, your personal think tank for all things startups and venture capital. I'm your host, Matt Cohen, founder and managing partner at Ripple Ventures. On today's show, we welcome founder and general partner of the 19 Special Mission Fund, Glenn Cowan, to discuss making the leap from the Canadian Special Forces to venture capital. Glenn is probably the most exciting guest we've ever had the pleasure of interviewing on the show. His incredible background and story serving with the Canadian Special Forces for almost 20 years will literally make your heart race throughout this episode. Glenn founded his first company, 19 Investments, while he was serving as a squadron commander in a Tier 1 Special Operations Unit, and more recently has launched the Special Mission Fund, which is Canada's first and only national security and critical infrastructure security fund. Glenn shares how he grew up in a family of entrepreneurs and how that made him always want to work in the innovation and technology sector. We dig into some of the lessons he learned from his time in the elite forces and how he eventually decided to launch his first venture fund earlier this year. Finally, we get Glenn to explain his investment thesis and strategy at 19 Investments and how his ability to assess risk on and off the battlefield have made him a better venture investor. But before we get started today, as our listeners probably know by now, the team at Ripple is always focused on helping our founders and portfolio companies find the best partners to work with. And when it comes to corporate finance and cash management, there's nobody we recommend more than the team at Jeeves. At Ripple, we manage all our fund expenses and employee credit cards using Jeeves. The team at Jeeves helped me get my team set up with physical and virtual cards in days. I was able to allow my teammates to expense items in multiple currencies, allowing them to pay for anything, anywhere, at any time. We weren't asked for any personal guarantees or to pay any setup or monthly SaaS fees. Not only does Jeeves save us time, but they also give us up to 3% cash back on our purchases, including expenses like Google, Facebook, or AWS every month. The best part is Jeeves puts up the cash and you settle once every 30 days in any currency you want, unlike some other corporate card companies that make you prepay every month. Listeners of Tank Talks can get set up today with a demo of Jeeves and take advantage of our Tank Talks special with a $250 sign-up bonus and skip the waitlist that already has thousands of companies waiting on it by visiting tryjeeves.com/Tank Talks. Use referral code Tank Talks to get set up today. Now let's jump into the tank for this week's episode with Glenn Cowan from 19 Investments. Thanks for joining us in the tank today, Glenn.
Matt, it is great to be here.
You know, Glenn, you are by far the most exciting guest I've ever had the pleasure of interviewing on the show. And that's no disrespect to all my previous guests. But given your incredible background serving with the Canadian Special Forces for almost 20 years, your story is just too good to pass up before we jump into the venture and technology side. So I would love it if you can give our audience a brief background on your journey in the Canadian Special Forces and how you eventually made your way into startups and technology.
Yeah, no, that's great. And I'm humbled to hear you say that. But the reality, Matt, is my story is one of many. And my story replicates, like many of my friends and peers that are out there, folks that are retired and many of whom are still serving, have very similar stories and many of which are far more exciting than mine. I think being a Special Forces soldier is something that's inherently just in your DNA. From a very young age, I wanted to be in the military. I wanted to be in the Special Forces. I did a trip to France in the summer and when I was 15 years old, and I toured the Normandy battlefields. And I kind of made myself a promise that said, if there's ever going to be another event like storming the beaches of Normandy or something like that, I'm like, I want to be a part of that. I don't want to miss out on that type of adventure and that type of opportunity. I went to McGill University and I joined a reserve Highland regiment called the Black Watch, which is Canada's oldest infantry regiment, very proud heritage. And I fell in love with being a soldier. And from there, I did everything in my power to continue to do as much soldiering, learn as much as I could to be the best soldier and officer I could. My story really is one of time and being in the right place at the right time, which kind of sounds a little bit convoluted sometimes. I did a component transfer when I graduated from McGill University to the regular force in the Canadian Forces. And I joined a regiment, a very proud regiment called the Princess Patricia's Canadian Light Infantry. And my posting message was literally for like 10 September 2001. So on my way out to my first posting in the battalion, 9/11 happened. And it just so happens that the battalion I was joining was the NATO High Readiness Force for Canada. And within a couple of months, we found ourselves as the first deployed entity into a combat theater for Canadian soldiers since the Korean War. And that battalion took part in all the major combat operations very early in the global war on terror. And it was when I was there, I did some work with some American special forces some of the top level special operators in the US tier one community. We were just sort of in kind of awe inspired by these guys, watching them work. And I kind of made a promise to myself again that as soon as I get home from Afghanistan, I'm going to do selection for Canada's top tier one special operations unit. And I was fortunate enough to do the selection. I made it through on my first go around. I joined as a very young troop commander, and immediately we were right back into combat operations as Canada committed troops to cleaning out Kandahar province. Throughout the course of my career, I did 10 deployments, 4 combat tours, 3 other missions in Afghanistan, some sensitive technologically enabled missions around the world, and supported a couple of hostage recovery efforts in Africa. And that unit at the time was providing tactical solutions for Canada's strategically relevant problem sets. So we got kind of a front row seat to understanding what the strategic problems were and how to solve them. And that ultimately led to the genesis of me sort of trying to think, how can we continue the mission in the private sector to continue to support Canada's national interests and keep a mission of service and delivering the effects for the good of Canada, continental North America, our NATO and Five Eyes allies.
Unbelievable to hear you say that you went to Paris and visited the beaches of Normandy, and that inspired you to want to make sure that you were part of history if that ever happened again. I remember going to visit the Toronto Stock Exchange trading floor with my brother, and I said I want to work on the trading floor when I was young. I did not say I wanted to go work on the beaches of Normandy with the Canadian Special Forces, but you did, and you kept pushing yourselves every time you saw a glimpse of something that inspired you, seeing the U.S. Special Forces and saying to yourself, I want to do that, but for the Canadian side of it, and then going in for 10 visits and missions to help protect the lives of people that you cared about. It's such an incredible story. And then you kept continuing to learn and inspire yourself with other things in like the startup and technology world, which is so impressive. We've had a lot of ex-Israeli Defense Force leaders come on the show who have also made their way into the technology world afterwards. But, just hearing your story kind of puts it all to shame, I have to say, from my perspective, even though it may be common for a lot of the people that you are engaged with. You say you served on multiple combat deployments in Afghanistan and information ops in Middle East, and even some big hostage recovery operations in Africa, where you're the strategic planner and tactical commander. And you also say you've worked with the Prime Minister of Canada, advising Minister of National Defense and Chief of Defense Staff on the tactical side. So were there any incredible career moments during your time with the Special Forces that were just totally insane, that stand out in your mind, that you still reflect on today in your new career in the life afterwards?
Yeah, every day there was a sort of a life-altering or career or sort of perspective-gathering moment. I'll save a lot of the war stories for sort of over beers, maybe. One of the things that we try to pride ourselves on is to not really talk too much about some of the truly insane moments, but they're there. And what I was really awe-inspired with was the people I worked with. I mean, I stood on the shoulders of giants, literally. The men and women that were part of my team. Every day I would see actions, humor, courage that literally were daily events. They became very commonplace to us, but they were truly awe-inspiring on reflection. What I would say, as sort of for the insane story perspective, I was fortunate enough to help build and shepherd a capability which was a high altitude parachute capability. And this was an insertion method that's very common for sort of top level special forces, to get as high up in the air as you can, as far away from your target as you can, and get as many guys out of an airplane at super high altitudes in the middle of the night, pull your parachutes really, really high, get into the slipstream, and just fly your parachute under kind of full night vision goggles, oxygen, navigation systems. You're really kind of a one-man pilot flying in a team to get to your location. I love parachuting, and that is just, for me, every time I do it, it's an insane moment. And what I love about the high altitude parachuting aspects of things is it's so complicated. It's such a complex plan, and it's so high risk that the amount of effort and detail and precision and support and rehearsals that go into it really bring everything together as a way of sort of delivering a fighting force to an objective. And it's crazy fun. I mean, just the sheer sense overload from a ramp opening, at over 30,000 feet. It's freezing cold. It's pitch black. You're on like a green hue of night vision. You've been pre-breathing oxygen. You have about 400 pounds of equipment on, and you kind of waddle your way to the end of a ramp, and it's just this void of blackness. And you just kind of see a little IR strobe on the guy in front of you, and you just fall out of the airplane. And that commit to me is like, there is no bigger commit. And so those are the moments I'd say that are pretty insane. And I use high altitude parachuting in the venture community to use it as a metaphor and an analogy for what it feels like to deploy resources and actually commit. So I use some of those nerve-wracking and awe-inspiring moments every day in the current role that with what we're building here at 19.
Holy fucking shit. I mean, my heart is racing just listening to that. First off, if you were, my investor and I was a founder and you told me that you jumped out of a plane at 30,000 feet in the middle of the night with oxygen and no real vision capabilities, I would do whatever you told me to do next with my business, because the risk that you were taking during that time pales in comparison to the risk any founder would take with their business. So I hope you use that story a lot. And, let's double click on that.
You kind of keyed on a couple of things. Risk, which I know what we might talk about a little bit later. Risk is a measure of impact and probability. The higher the risk, the tighter the plan has to be. The more in sync people have to be, the better the communication is, the more contingency plans you need. What I love about the parachuting analogy is there are two things that are factually correct. One, when you leave the ramp, you can't go back. And two, you're going to hit the ground. It's what happens between here and here that, decides the fate of how successful you are. And that's where, in the analogy of the venture capital world, that commit is the same. When we deploy capital, when we back a founder, when we get involved in a company, we commit and we can't just kind of say, okay, we're done. So we're very hands-on investors, and we want to solve all the problems between ramp and ground. Because the other thing about the high altitude parachute is it's literally just a taxi service. It's like your Uber to get you to your job. Once you hit the ground, that's only phase one. You still have to walk 10 kilometers, sneak into someone's compound and grab a bad guy. The parachute part is just phase one. And so what I love about it is the amount of contingency plans, the amount of rehearsals, and how in sync your team needs to be, and how you need to be willing to pivot and call audibles as things drop off and things get fucked up. And really, I love that analogy for defining and explaining risk, but also aligning teams to a common mission on how to execute and get as close to your drop zone as possible, knowing that you're going to have guys whose chutes don't open and have a cutaway and have to go to an alternate drop zone. You're going to have midair collisions. You're going to have night vision goggle failure. You need redundant GPS. So you have 3 GPS systems, redundant altimeters. We build in all these series of redundancies. So by the time we go to jump, we actually have a fairly good confidence that shit's going to work out. But it never does. And it's always a bit of a gong show trying to untangle your parachute when they're caught in your night vision and you're falling. And you need to have your parachute pulled by 25,000 feet if you're going to make the distance that you got to cover, and you get lost and things are all messed up. It's pretty comical. And then on top of all that, what I love about the Special Forces community is dark humor, and humor as a way of providing levity in stressful situations. Some of the hardest times I've ever laughed, Matt, were in gunfights, literally, because the guys and gals you're with, the only way to make sense of the craziness is to kind of laugh at it and laugh in the face of it. And I found that has helped me, the venture world. We've made some investments that have been kind of like crashed helicopters. And when you have that scenario, you can't give up. Like, you have to deal with the shit show that you inherit, or whatever happens, and you got to fight your way through it. And I think that shows that level of resiliency that is sort of built into us, and with a no-fail sort of mindset. I've used that very effectively in the venture space with founders, with LPs, aligning teams, sitting on boards, working through problems, and applying that no-fail mentality.
Yeah, I mean, you've just shared so many great analogies. And, it reminds me of the analogy we had from one of our earliest podcasts with Tony Van Marken from First Ascent, when he had climbed 7 of the summits in the world, about how climbing to the top of Everest wasn't the goal. The goal was actually to get back to base camp safely, and how 80% of people are ill prepared on the way back down. And that's why a lot of the accidents and unfortunate deaths happen, is because they think reaching the top, just like, maybe doing the parachute, is the part of the journey that only matters. But that's just the beginning of it. It's getting, to the base camp, getting to the compound, and getting back to, your reserve site safely. Also, I love the part about suppressing the fear by using laughter, because it allows you to focus on a lot of the things at hand, and instead of letting fear overtake your mind, which is another great analogy for some of the things that our founders get emotionally attached to, and it blocks their capabilities from making, the right decisions or even preparing for them. So let's double click on that. You've had some incredible journeys through your time in the special forces, but after spending almost 20 years there, you decided for your next move, which was going out and starting 19 Investments. How did that mind shift happen, and what finally made you make that leap into tech investing?
Yeah, I come from a very entrepreneurial family. I come from a long lineage of family business. My great-grandfather started an import-export business, and he provided all the hot chocolate to the British Expeditionary Force in the First World War. My grandfather started a lot of companies. He started Double Bubble Gum. My grandfather, I didn't grow up with my grandfather taking me fishing. I grew up with him kind of throwing stock charts at me and saying, hey, read this, kid. My dad is a business mentor for me. He's a real inspiration for me. And from a very young age, my dad would involve me and my brothers in the family business. We would have board meetings. My mom would take minutes. He involved us very early in what was happening, and he was super transparent, the good, the bad, and the ugly. And I didn't realize the impact that was having on me at the time, but it made me pretty savvy with investing in money just as a proprietary investor. A buddy of mine, that I went to high school with, started a really successful storage the company's called Storage Capital, but it's a commercial real estate and the self-storage business. And I was in Afghanistan at the time, and we were getting tax-free money. When we would do tours, we were tax-free. We would get, for a young kid, we'd get like an extra 50 grand in 6 months. It's tax-free, danger and hardship. I started putting that money to work instead of, buying a pimped out truck or a fast car or something. I started investing that money. And my first investment was a debt investment into Storage Capital. That remains one of my largest personal investments to this date. It's been amazing. We've done some great deals throughout some of the assets that we have within the family business. But when I got it, and so I incorporated 19 Investments in 2013 while I was serving as a squadron commander within our Tier 1 Special Operations National Mission Unit. But for me, Matt, that was like as much fun as watching paint dry. I didn't get it. They'd explain to me cap rates and, building a portfolio in that particular asset class, and it just didn't speak to me. So, but I started to learn about the incorporating cycle, building a business, legal, insurance, everything else we needed to do to build my first business. That year, I also was really severely injured on the job. And that started me on a journey of thinking that there has to be life after the military. It ultimately led to me being medically released from the military in 2016. And it was there that I started working with an American security company heavily invested in cyber and data privacy, and heavily aligned with the United States intelligence community in Langley, Virginia. I'll leave, just for sake of podcast, and I mean, everyone knows who we're talking about, but I'll leave sort of the 3-letter acronyms and whatnot out of it. And I saw a glimpse of like private sector security being applied to the national security space. Ultimately, that started sort of my eureka moment of saying, hey, all throughout my career in Special Forces, we had access to the best technology. We were the most resourced military units in the world. We were working with our counterparts in the United States top level, both on the Navy and the Army side. We had all the assets. We would find our targets by using satellites and space and GPS and lasers, and we just took it for granted. We never actually kind of stepped back and said, hey, there's an entire tech ecosystem at play here. We just know how to use it. We know how to integrate it. And we know what works and what doesn't work intuitively. And that sort of led to kind of like the aha moment of saying, hey, rather than just trying to work for one of these tech companies or defense companies. Let's buy these companies. And then let's buy them and use our network, which is a really high barrier of entry to get into. I mean, you can show up at the front gate of my old unit, and if you have $10 billion, you're not getting in the gate. It's an environment where money can't buy access. You have to be in the club. And it's a very small club globally. And it's an easy club to vet. And once you're vetted, it's an immediate trust. So if I want to do some work with an American company or an American special operations unit, or I've got a cool piece of tech that I want to take right to the end user, I want to say, break this piece of equipment. I want your feedback. I want you to tell me what works, what doesn't, what needs to change. Pick up the phone and you call a buddy. And if he doesn't know you, he'll call his buddy, and you're probably only one or two removed. And they'll say, yeah, Glenn's a good guy. Or they might say, yeah, he's not a good guy. He's kind of an asshole, but at least he's validated in the community. You know what I mean? And that's very hard, because this day and age, I joke with my Navy SEAL buddies, like, everyone's a Navy SEAL. Like, it's like, come on, man. Like, you're not. Like, and it's that validation. And for you to go and check my bona fides is really hard to do in that community. And so by being a part of it, it just allows for this really expedited validation of tech. And we're doing that all the time as one of our big value propositions and differentiators with the companies that we invest in. Not only do we understand what the inbound threats are by probably 4 or 5 years, understanding like what are the major security trends that are happening and how do we get out in front of it, but we also understand what technology solves it. And then the biggest piece of the equation is how does that integrate with the existing technologies that are being used? Because you can build the best widget, a company can have the best product. If it doesn't integrate, it won't get used, and it won't develop a capability. And we've built another business unit within 19 to address enhancing and building and integrating capability.
Yeah, and we'll get to all of that in a moment. But I didn't even realize that you had a bit of exposure at an early age to the sort of, corporate and business side. I mean, Double Bubble, for our audience who may be too young to even know that, was this pink wrapper gum that came in like a white bucket.
Yeah.
It would taste like shit after the first 5 minutes of chewing it, but it had amazing bubble blowing capabilities and would come with this really cute cartoon wrappers inside of it. So that's amazing that you saw that firsthand.
Yeah, and my grandfather was the first guy to put a stick of bubble gum in the old baseball card packs.
Oh, I love those. They taste like crap too. That makes sense.
You totally, like the white powder. You're kind of
yeah, exactly.
Yeah, but and he, and I didn't really understand what kind of what exits were or what M&A was or like how companies were scaling. But we had some really interesting in the history of our family enterprise. We had some really interesting exits. Some what would be today relatively high profile exits. And they weren't back then. It wasn't really a thing. It was just kind of the natural evolution of a business. You know what I mean? We weren't like optimizing value and like, trying to push for highest valuation. And the venture didn't really exist. It was just kind of all bootstrapped business, sort of growing your P&L, building your revenues. And then someone comes along and says, hey, I think you'd integrate nicely in my company. And here's a little check and off you go. It was a very different, or my understanding back then was a very different ecosystem than what we're experiencing now with sort of funding cycles and a venture cycle and how to scale company and the different instruments for fundraising and capital and growth within companies is much more broad than it was sort of in those early days.
Yeah. It's also interesting to hear you say that, like, kind of like a ex-hockey player who, finishes their career and then they go and work for like a boring asset manager. And then that's like watching paint dry for them, but they don't really have any motivation to go and see what else is out there. But you had that, even though you had exposure and even success in the sort of private investing world, the debt world, the real estate world, all those kind of things. And you did not stop there because I think your time in the special forces allowed you to see kind of into the future and think about ways that you could bring it forward based on, the boys club network that you were obviously, welcomed into because of all the time you served to them.
Let's, sorry, I just want to correct that boys club.
Yes.
It often gets sort of pursued that way. Canadian Armed Forces nowadays is really working hard to sort of eliminate that. And they're doing it very well. Some of the best soldiers I served with were women. I use the word fraternity all the time to describe the sort of environment that we're in. But it is, as we're it's an interesting and really valuable aspect of what we're seeing in the venture space. I came out of the I came out of the CVCA conference, and an astronomical amount of talk on ESG and DEI and female founders. And I couldn't agree more with, empowering, 50% of our talent that has kind of potentially been left on the sidelines historically. And the military, despite some of the negative press it has around some of the issues it's dealing with now, the military is actually very forward leaning on really empowering women, equality, bringing them into these roles. And quite literally, some of the best soldiers I ever served with were women.
Yeah, I mean, amazing. Thank you for clarifying that. And I definitely agree with you that the venture world has a lot of work to do on its own as well. And we're trying to help with that with our Ripple X Fellowship program. But I've heard you say that venture capital is a special operation. What do you mean by that? And how has your career in special ops helped you navigate the venture capital ecosystem?
No, it's a great question. And raising a fund is super hard. People would tell me that as I was getting into this. They're like, what? They're like, are you a glutton for punishment? I mean, what are you doing? And a lot of the, initial LPs, I was very successful with having doors open to me because of my background on my thesis. If nothing else, people would say, who's this guy? Let's at least hear what he has to say. So I never had a meeting declined as I was fundraising. And the majority of the discussion at the end of it was, hey, we like you. We think you could be a talented manager. We really like your thesis. We just can't really get behind, you're a first-time fund manager. We need to build venture track record, yada, yada. Or they'd say, what does a special forces guy know about venture? And a lot of it, I would kind of, depending on my mood at the time, I would say, you know what? I know more than you do. Because when we look at a special forces operation, part of a big part of my thesis is that the way a very high risk special forces mission is executed is identical and parallel to the way a venture investment plays out. And when we break it down to its component parts, what it is it's a deployment of a finite resource at a specific point in time and place to achieve a specific effect in a super high risk, high reward environment. You need a specially selected, trained, rehearsed team. You need contingency plans, supporting plans, and then you got to get the fuck out of there. You got to either leave, egress, pivot, you get new int on the objective, and you got to change and move on the fly into a new objective. So there's going to be that exit or that defining decision point. And we'll see that throughout the cycle. So finite resources, high risk, high reward, and you got to get out of there. That's what we did really, really well, probably better than anyone else in any industry, is identifying and planning these really precise high-risk missions. The high-altitude parachute as a phase 1 to a 5-phase complex mission when our job is to go and terminate a key Al-Qaeda leadership figure. I mean, that's pretty high risk. When 18 guys go in on 200 guys, that's pretty high risk. And you jump from 30,000 feet to get there, there's a lot of variables that are going to go wrong. And there's a lot of variables in a venture investment that are going to go wrong. And it's kind of like water off a duck's back, and you figure out the path of least resistance and you reinforce success with more resources. And it's in the special ops world, you hit this spot of what's called relative superiority. And it's a concept that Admiral McCraven, who was a former commander at JSOC, well known for make your bed analogies. He was commander at JSOC during the bin Laden raid, a really respected military leader. And early in his days as a young naval officer, he built case study books on sort of famed special operations missions. And it's this defining point in time and space of relative superiority where you lose the advantage. And it's recognizing when and how and where you're going to lose the advantage. And that's your exit and that's your pivot. And so when we look at, applying that to the venture world, we build what we kind of call decision support matrices. And so we already know what our decisions are going to be. We've already built the conditions for those decisions, and we've already built probably 3 or 4 contingencies for each decision so that if it doesn't play out the way we want it to, we know exactly what we're going to do. We can call an audible and we move in that direction with no drama, no stress, no emotion.
I'm thinking in my head sort of like the parallels you're making between getting the team to quickly think on their feet and, augment a preconceived plan. But you're dealing with special forces trained individuals who have experience and understanding. Unfortunately, a lot of the times, these are first time founders, or these are people who've never really had these problems been faced with. And so they have to think on their feet, but they're not trained to do it like the way you have in all the different scenario plannings that you have with the special forces. So how are you able to instill confidence and even seek out opportunities with those kinds of founders, not knowing what kind of unpredictable environments they're going to enter into the venture world? And how have you been able to support them in sort of deploying assets and resources faster than anyone else could?
Special operators, like the community I came out of, we thrive in ambiguity. And there's a lot of misnomers about the special forces communities as being elite or super soldiers, or that's garbage. What special forces does really, really well is the basics. We're brilliant at the basics, and we always revert to first principles. And so we keep things as shit simple as we can. But we're moving into these environments that we know nothing about either. I can literally remember the unit that I was a part of. We were on super high readiness. I won't mention how high readiness, just to protect the operational security of the unit. But it would not be uncommon for us to get a phone call and be on a plane in very short order, moving into a country that we've never been before with one or two folks to supply strategically relevant decision quality information to our political executive back in Ottawa. And the mission that we got was go there and do good things. It was so vague, and we had to kind of figure it out on the ground. And I think that's what a founder needs to do. There is no playbook. There is no, hey, we've done this before, what do we revert to? So we build processes of first principles that are relevant no matter the scenario that we're in. And then we figure it out. And this is why I think at early stage venture investing, one of the first metrics you need to look at is the founder, the team, the management. What are these folks like as leaders? What are they like under pressure? How much conviction do they have? How much fortitude do they have? Are they going to freak out and throw their teddy bear in a corner? And so, that is such a huge part of, looking at and evaluating the team. In my former unit, the last job I had was I was responsible for running all the selection and assessments of the incoming special operators. And we had a really robust process. It's our secret sauce, so I'm not going to get into anything that we did or what we looked at to select the attributes that we were looking for in the folks that made up the unit. But there was a process, and it was very specific, and it was quite binary. And so, we had this assessment understanding of how to evaluate people in specific roles. And there were so many soldiers that would apply to try to do selection. And we would, we ultimately didn't take them. And it didn't mean that they weren't great soldiers. It just meant that they weren't great for that specific role. And that's what we need to continue to refine as we're looking at founders and the teams and the executives that they're putting together. We need to pick, assess, screen, and select people for role clarity, and then empower them in those roles with clear direction, but also, wide enough arcs that we give them the freedom of maneuver to let them bring their ideas to the table. And it's a little bit like kind of letting dogs off the leash, give them enough that they need to know that give them enough rope to kind of hang themselves with, so to speak, and then shepherd them through this process. And if a person or a founder in a startup can't sort of respond or support that or guide their team through that process, then they're probably not someone that we're going to want to back. And so we spend a lot of time, or as much as we can, with our founders, and we draw on the lessons that we have from building really high performance teams that focus in high stress environments. And we really look to leverage that as we select and look for the right management, right founders, and the right folks to shepherd and move some of these capabilities and technologies forward.
That's really well explained in terms of how you focus on like the process, not the player, and not the resume they show up with. We like to look at founders in early stages in terms of not what they've built, but the process at which they went to think about their journey into building it, and how they iterate and the velocity at which they change course quickly when they realize that their hypothesis is off base. The other thing that we asked them about is, are you hiring the maker or the manager at this current stage? Do you think you're hiring someone from Google who's going to come in and do everything they've done at Google, but you're forgetting they have a team of 20 people that they've relied on because they were the manager, and now you're putting them into position to be a maker. And that's very different. It's like you were, being able to bring the super soldiers in, but you didn't want that kind of person in. You wanted someone specific for the role that you needed them to fill, which makes a lot of sense. I think it's also fair to say that the risk you faced on the battlefield are not really comparable to the risks that are currently being faced in the conference room. So, how do you assess risk with a special forces mentality and apply it to your investment thesis and the risk assessment for today? And in addition, how would you assess complex risks and understand what it means to navigate with limited resources as a first-time fund manager?
Risk is all about impact and probability. And so when we look at risk, we want to look at, how probable is an event to happen? And then if it happens, what is the impact of that? So if it's low probability, low impact, it's not even a speed bump in our decision-making process. We just cruise right through it. If it's high probability, low impact, then we need to start building some contingency plans. Like, we don't want this to happen, but if it does, it's probably not a big deal, but we should have something in place to deal with it. If it's low probability, high impact, then it's something on the periphery that's probably not going to happen. It's kind of a market risk or another type of sort of inbound external factor. If it does, it can really disrupt operations. So you can't forget it. You need to still plan for it, but you can probably build reasonable assumptions in whether or not things are going to, play out that certain way. Where we really focus is high probability, high impact. And this is the high altitude parachute jump. It is there is every single time we do it, something catastrophic goes wrong to one of the folks that's exiting that aircraft. But it's not the end of the world. Because we know that it is going to happen, we build a system and a series of contingency plans. So every single person that's part of that mission knows exactly what's going to happen, how to communicate it, which is an incredibly important thing, and then who's calling the shots and who is directing the fight at that particular point in time. And so people think of a military organization as very hierarchical. I was a squadron commander. I was responsible for quite a few people, lots of resources. I had the eyes of government on me for some of the missions we were doing. And I had to have the humility to say, I'm not the decision maker right now. The guy at the back of the stack is, and the stack is the parachutes flying. So, I'm a big guy. I weigh about 250 pounds. I'm always the first guy out of the aircraft, just the way that we stack. But it's the stack master at the back who can see everybody, and he's the one directing traffic. When we're in a close quarter fight, it's a role called the breacher. The breacher directs traffic. He's not the boss of the operation, but when the breacher talks, everybody listens, regardless of where you are sort of in the hierarchy. And I think when we enter into those sort of high probability, high impact risk scenarios, we need to know who's calling the shots when and be able to pass control back and forth very quickly with no ego, because that particular subject matter expert, he's the one that's in the best position to make the decision at that point in time. From a decision-making perspective, where I really try to work with founders is getting an assessment of good decisions are all about time and opportunity. We would call them high-value targets. So the mission that we had predominantly in Afghanistan was we were tasked with removing Al-Qaeda and Taliban leadership, cut the head off the snake, literally and figuratively. Our mission task verbs were very aggressive, and we did our job with ruthless precision. And if we were moving into a compound where we knew there was, lots of personal security details, multiple leaders, big meetings, we knew that we were going to get in a gunfight, we would build our planning days in advance. We would stack the odds in our favor. We would get as many resources as we could. We maintained the initiative. We moved on our time. We always controlled how we approached risk. We controlled the tempo. We controlled everything to the best of our ability. And so we had lots of time, lots of opportunity. We also involved everybody in the plan, everybody that was going on the objective was involved in the plan. So they had ownership in the plan. If I'm going to ask a guy to go through a door, not knowing what's on the other side of that door, I want him to have ownership and buy-in on that plan. Now, there were other times when, different technological systems would spark like that. And we'd be like, hey, this bad guy's in this location right now. We got to go get him. Shut the fuck up. Get in the truck. We're going now. And there wasn't time to build a good plan. There wasn't time for debate. It wasn't a democracy. It was, I'm the boss, go. And that's when you needed, again, to have everybody fall in line, understand time and opportunity, and when and how, to the best of our ability, we would always try to explain the context of our decision making, because we made horrible decisions all the time. And, we kind of had the edict that a bad decision was better than no decision. And so once we made the decision, we would commit our resources. We would go into a process of after action review afterwards, which were probably some of the bloodiest discussions I've ever seen, is how to evaluate a gunfight when things go bad. You put a group of 30 or 40 alpha personalities in a room where there's been catastrophic failure, and then critique it with leaving your ego at the door. It's some of the most ruthless discussions I've ever seen, but incredibly valuable for the process, so that you learn from that. So the next time you're put in one of those situations where there's not a lot of time or opportunity, you can learn from your mistakes and move back into those environments with confidence, knowing that the team has sort of regrouped, restructured, and is ready for the next fight.
Yeah, it sounds like a culture of adaptability, but also rigidness when it is necessary is important, and something that I think a lot of our early stage startups should listen to and pay attention to when it goes through, like, hey, there's all of a sudden a huge change in the market. COVID, for example, like, let's just not sit by and wait and talk about this forever. Let's have a decision. Even if it may be the wrong one, let's start to make decisions quicker. And whoever's at the front lines, not maybe the CEO or founder, but somebody else who's dealing with all the customers who've been affected, they're the one we should be listening to, not the founder who's been sitting, in the board meetings for the last, couple of weeks talking with non-operators. Is a great lesson to learn. And I'm sure a lot of those post-mortem conversations you had that were bloodbaths afterwards are probably 10 times worse than a lot of the worst board meetings I've ever had. So that's also something that a lot of people in our world can learn from, of how to hear everyone's voice and get to a mutual understanding of where everyone's coming from, which is amazing.
You need thick skin in this business. And there's no thicker skin than the environment that I came out of. And then literally, turn 180 and laugh your ass off about it, because there's no other way to deal with the stress and deal with the, the environment you're in, other than to kind of look yourself in the mirror and just laugh and try not to take yourself too seriously, So yeah, good times all around.
I got to ask you, what excites you about where your experience in the special ops world can help transform industries and change our perspective on traditional approaches in the startup and tech ecosystem?
Yeah, one of the things I'm most humbled by, and I've spoken with a few co-investors who run similar thesis in the US, and they all say the same thing. I find that in the business I'm in now, I'm actually doing more for Canada and North American strategic national interests than I was when I was in a top-tiered special forces unit. The technology and what we're seeing with the necessity of public-private partnership to solve these wicked and challenging problems is this national security ecosystem can't not listen to the private sector, private capital, patriotic Canadians that want to invest in technology and founders and build innovative ecosystems that solve some of these significant problems. And what we found throughout COVID, and really in the last 10 years, again, certainly to our thesis, is I kind of call it this new normal of national security. So our fund is a dual-use technology fund that focuses on national security and critical infrastructure. It's not a military fund. We don't invest in military technologies. We don't touch anything that has to do with guns or kinetic weapons or anything like that. We invest in cyber, geospatial data, big data, edge analytics, forward deployed GPUs, space and low orbit satellite, safe cities. But what we're seeing is this overlap between these traditional defense environments and new tech. And I think it's really important for your listeners to understand that some people almost have like this allergic reaction when they hear about government or intelligence agencies or the military. Microsoft is probably one of the biggest defense contractors in the US. And it's this new normal that we're in, where we also need to empower, a new generation of warriors. I mean, in Canada here, we're looking to stand up this cyber warrior capability. Everything in our personal lives is interwoven with things that might have used to have been a traditional national security or exclusive government on government or state on state kind of conflict. And it's one of the areas why I think, we've built sort of great critical infrastructure tech stacks. It's such an interwoven aspect of our society that we can't not protect new and or traditional critical infrastructures. And the new battlefield is playing out in corporate Canada and corporate America. 19 in one of our portfolio companies solved one of Canada's most significant national security threats during COVID. We did it in 15 minutes. And I had a call from a very senior director level of public safety. He said, you need to get to my office right now and you need to explain to me how the fuck you guys did that. Because we have wicked smart founders building amazing tech, and they can do it so fast. When we're solving these big national security problems, we don't worry about procurement. We don't worry about spending. We don't worry about, bureaucratic process that takes 18 months. If a founder has a good idea and the tech works, they get funded fast, they build it fast, they deploy it, and they solve the problem fast. And that's where we're starting to see this shift into this sort of private-public partnership where a fund like ours or other private capital investors need to be stakeholders in this new normal of national security. We are a new tool in the toolbox that can be used to solve some of these key problems.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the public-private partnerships have only been accelerated in the last several years because of the speed at which innovation is happening in the private sector, and the government just can't keep up funding all these DARPA-like projects, to create the first versions of the internet early on, or satellites, technology, or things like that, that they just need private capital to keep up the momentum with which these founders are innovating at such rapid levels. So it makes sense for why funds like yours need to be happening more and more in places like Canada. So, can you explain a little bit more how you ended up joining forces with the Shopify co-founder, Daniel Weinand, as your GP partner?
Yeah, no, Daniel's great. Daniel and I we've built a very deep and dear friendship over the past 4 years. I was introduced to Daniel through a gentleman named Mike Janke. Mike runs probably one of the most successful cyber funds in the US called Data Tribe. Mike, like myself, was a SEAL Team 6 operator pre 9/11. Mike built one of the largest security companies in the US, had a phenomenal exit, and sits on the boards, on the innovation boards of a lot of the 3-letter agencies south of the border. I was introduced to a company that's in my portfolio now called Strider. We just closed a Series B. We just raised $45 million and closed a Series B led by Valor Equity Partners. And I was invited into that deal because it was my first venture deal, and it would be a fund maker if it was in my fund. I'm convinced of that. So I was invited into this deal because as an end user, I intuitively got what the company was doing. I liked the founders. We got along well. But above and beyond, it's an American company. I opened up a Canadian market where it's green fields up here. There's no one doing what I'm doing. Anyway, long story short, Strider was incubated in Data Tribe's Cyber Foundry, of which Mike ran. And Mike wrote the first check into MindBridge AI, an Ottawa-based company, and would come up to Ottawa quite frequently. And Mike formed a friendship with Daniel. And after I got to know Mike, he said, you guys live 5 minutes apart. You got to meet Daniel. And so Mike was an amazing mentor for me, went out of his way to pay it forward, maybe saw a little bit of him and myself sort of from his early journey. And again, this venture world we're in is very much a team sport, specifically in the national security domain. And we really want to complement each other. Long story short, Daniel and I met and we just started hanging out, walking dogs. And we would go for long walks and we would just talk about life and stuff. Daniel became a He's one of Canada's, if most successful venture-backed entrepreneurs. He left the company. He left Shopify in 2017 and probably doesn't like to be referred to as the Shopify guy. But that is very much kind of like me as the special forces guy. You got to use your past and your experiences, the good and the bad for what those are. And we just started talking, and Daniel was a mentor of mine on the business side. And I would bring some of my challenges or frustrations or obstacles. And over time, as our friendship grew and evolved, Daniel just said, how can I get involved in what you're building? He's a huge supporter of veterans. He's a huge supporter of active service, Canadian Armed Forces personnel. He's got an incredibly large heart. And there's just a cultural alignment. And that discussion sort of started, hey, what's in the realm of the possible? And so Daniel is, involved. He's, incredibly smart. He's, grounded, and we hit it off, and we hang out all the time and build businesses together. It's pretty fun.
That's awesome. I love the pay it forward mentality that you have experienced in this venture community, just like I did when I got started. I tried to shake my old banker job as well when going into this world to not be typecast. And you probably, and Daniel obviously wanted to kind of hide that a little bit, to be taken seriously as someone who wanted to try and build their way in a new industry. And you guys have successfully done that together with the recent launch of your $50 million first fund, with the support of Kensington Capital as your anchor investor with a $10 million commitment. So first off, congrats on the successful launch.
Thank you.
And secondly, can you tell us how you used your special ops experience to help tackle the challenges of raising capital as a first-time investor?
Everyone's probably familiar, with how Hollywood has defined Navy SEAL Hell Week. In our world, it was selection. We called it selection. And it's hard. Like, it's the hardest thing you can ever put yourself through mentally and physically. Fundraising, to me, is selection of the venture world. And this is where you cut your teeth. And there's a stick-to-itiveness that's required and a resiliency that's required. I was introduced to the managing partners at Kensington through another friend of mine, and I was afforded the opportunity to kind of pitch them, and their response was kind of the same. It was, hey, we like you, we like your thesis. We just got to get to know you better. So I spent about 9 months building a relationship, building some trust, getting to know each other. And then I presented Kensington with 3 very specific deals that I had access to. And so we did 3 deals through SPVs as a way of helping me build track record. So they allocated some capital to these specific SPV deals. And I took the board responsibilities for our little syndicate. We used their capital. I put some of my own in. I'm a big believer in having skin in the game as well. I put some capital in, and we did these 3 deals. And, if they were in the fund, we'd be performing really, really well right now. One is a sort of, we'll call it a data privacy algorithm. This is the company Strider. We did an investment in a company called Tomahawk Robotics out of Melbourne, Florida, which is a common control platform for a whole host of drones. Again, it is the leading sort of control platform for the entire US DoD. It's a hardware software company, and we really enjoy working with these guys. And then we invested in a Canadian tech company called Ventus Respiratory. It's a long, convoluted story, but what we've built together with Kensington is this respirator, which is a military-grade respirator to protect your lungs against the hazards on the battlefield. And the precursor company, people thought I was crazy for buying a mask company before COVID. And said, no one's going to wear masks. Masks is bullshit, blah, blah, blah. And we really wanted to focus on the military market because we knew that the dangers and the hardships that soldiers experience on the battlefield, there's no one addressing this space. Probably 5.5 million soldiers in Western democracies. This product doesn't exist. And so we built a really, really high-end product with technological integration. It's become one of the military's kind of first wearable devices linked to communications. We're really excited about the future of this company. And that was 1/9 from our fund. That was our first deployment when we did a seed close recently into Ventus Respiratory.
That's amazing. I love how you kind of walk before you ran with, a lead investor like Kensington, trying to build relationships with actual deals, deals together through SPVs. That's a really smart way of doing it.
Well, that was their idea as a way of get to know you. Commit enough, but if it doesn't work, it's not a 10-year commitment with, capital calls every year or whatever. And after about a year of working through the SPVs, again, there were some really ugly moments, truthfully. And I think I showed my grit and my determination as a manager and someone who can roll up their sleeves and get involved in companies. And I didn't cut and run. I maintained sort of mission focus and a no fail mentality. And I think when they saw that, as we built our relationship and when we rounded out the team, because it was important for Kensington that, I'm not a venture guy historically. So I built my team with another co-GP who we'll announce shortly, a very experienced security venture capital investor who's joining our team as a co-GP, and Daniel. And when we built that sort of trifecta of our GP, bringing all our requisite skill sets together, I think that satisfied Kensington's confidence in my ability to take their feedback, build what's needed to be built, and then throughout some other great discussions with them and their team, they decided that it would be a good move for them to anchor our fund with a $10 million capital investment.
Oh, that's fantastic. Congrats again. One thing I wanted to ask you that you mentioned at the beginning of the podcast was this new defense innovation ecosystem that you're building called Capability Labs, described as the Y Combinator for defense innovation. Can you share more about this program you're running alongside the venture fund?
Absolutely. So at 19, we have two business units. Our fund, we call the Special Mission Fund, and it sits sort of co-located and proximate to 19 Capability Labs, which is a hub of technological innovation and integration. And really what we have seen working with founders and end users is there's a massive disconnect between what's needed and sort of how to deploy and build it. And often it's a lexicon or a translation issue. And 19 really sits at that intersection of private and public, of national security end users that have a very high barrier of entry for founders, or they just don't really know what's needed for operational security reasons or whatever. They don't know how to build it. And so we at Capability Labs work with our founders to help build and validate the technology before it deploys into the end users. And we work with the end users to really understand their pain points and then fund privately the companies that we know can solve those pain points and then deploy that technology. And this is where, from a fund perspective, there's a lot of tech transfer between Capability Labs and the fund, in the sense that if we make a fund investment, that portfolio company will benefit from the host of subject matter experts that we have at Capability Labs. And if we are not sure about a company from an investment perspective, we'll bring them into the lab, we'll work with them, we'll innovate their product, we'll take it to the end user, we'll validate it, we'll get the no BS feedback from the end user. And then when we are comfortable and we've validated it, we have dry powder in the fund to be able to, support with capital the companies that we think are going to kind of win the day and solve that problem. And so it's run by a dear friend of mine named Arjun Graywal. Arjun served in the unit with me for 12 years prior to working at the office of the CISO for cloud enterprise at IBM. The way that we describe ourselves when we worked together was Arj was sneaky and I was smashy. And so, at 19, we're kind of the sneaky and smashy show where we have a lot of overlap. I run the fund. Arj runs Capability Labs. Daniel's heavily involved in both. We've built an amazing team. We have access to, a whole host. We call it our task force of subject matter experts, many of whom are still serving in the intelligence community, the signals intelligence community, the special forces community, the private security community. And we bring this cohort together to really empower our founders with the sort of acceleration and innovation that they need to really refine their product and their company to service the end user's requirements.
Wow, that's incredible. I mean, your thesis around tier one military units and taking small amounts of resources, applying them in a very effective and highly versatile way is so unconventional when it comes to being applied to the venture capital industry. So I wish you not the best of luck. And I think you guys are going to be extremely successful in both your capability labs and your 1-9 investments missions. Now, before we wrap things up, we always like to ask our guests for their fast favorites. So first off, your favorite podcast.
Recently, it's a podcast called The Everyday Warrior. And it's a men's journal podcast. It's run by my dear friend, Mike Sorelli. Mike was a SEAL Team 6 officer. We met. I was just on his podcast, actually. And really, he tries to, break down from sort of a special operations context, just everyday people out pounding the pavement, doing the good work and getting their insights from their warrior-like experiences as they're moving throughout their day. So Everyday Warrior is my favorite podcast. Check him out.
Yeah, definitely got to check that one. I'll listen to one that you were on. Next one, favorite tech gadget?
Whoop. I got my Whoop, and it's amazing. I found my injury that I sustained really impacted my sleep. And what I love about Whoop is it builds this baseline and track of your sleep, your nutrition, your output, and your recovery from strenuous activities. So I've been wearing my Whoop, and the guys laugh at me because I'm tracking my heart rate when I skydive now. And my friends laugh at me because my heart rate's still up at like 170 while I'm in the plane. And they're like, dude, just breathe, man. Just calm it down. I'm like, I am calm. Anyway, it allows them to call you out on when you're freaking out skydiving.
Oh, that's fantastic. All right. Next one, your favorite new trend.
I'm a big cold plunger. I think cold plunging is like the answer to everyone's everyday aches and pains. I bought a 170-gallon cow trough, fill it with cold water and sit in there for as long as you can.
How long have you lasted? I've lasted about 3 to 4 minutes in Georgian Bay in the freezing winter with an ice pick. I
have an aversion to the cold. And so for me, it's as challenging mentally from a resilience as just dealing with the pain. Probably 3 minutes. Maybe, I don't know. I'm a bit of a, I don't know. But man, does it feel good. First thing in the morning, it almost replaces the need for coffee in the sense like you feel like you've drank 10 shots of espresso as you kind of come out of that thing.
Fantastic. Next one, favorite book?
Fiction. Gates of Fire by Stephen Pressfield. It sort of was probably the inspiration for the movie 300 and the Spartans at the Battle of Thermopylae. It's an incredibly well-written book. I love everything by Stephen Pressfield. But to answer that question, books serve different parts of your life. A couple of the books that I always have around, Tribe by Sebastian Junger, The Almanac of Naval Ravikant, and Daring Greatly by Brené Brown.
Oh, wow. Those are some amazing ones. We'll have to list them all. And last but not least, your favorite life lesson.
Daring Greatly by Brené Brown, the power of vulnerability and how vulnerability is a very impacting strength. There has been a lot of hardship and processing and reflecting on wins, losses, failures, successes, and understanding how to speak candidly about your emotions and how you're feeling and being vulnerable and opening yourself up to others and what a source of strength that is probably my most recent and favorite life lesson.
That is fantastic. And like I said at the top of the podcast, this has definitely been the most exciting guest we've ever had on the show. So thank you for not disappointing with Glenn Cowan, founder and managing partner at 1-9 Investments.
Matt, thanks very much. It's been a pleasure speaking with you and I look forward to having a beer.
Thanks for listening to another episode of Tank Talks. To learn more about this episode, be sure to go to Apple Podcast or Spotify to find more detailed notes on this episode or to check out previous episodes. Also, if you enjoyed this episode, please leave us a review and a rating as it helps us out a lot. And hit that subscribe button so you can get notified when new episodes come out. Finally, make sure to give me a follow on Twitter at Matty B. Cohen or at Tank Talk Podcast to stay up to date on new episodes or to be a guest on our show. Till next time,